Emma's hand froze on Shadow's massive head, her 16-year-old fingers tangling in fur darker than the October night. The 110-pound wolf hybrid had gone rigid beneath her touch, amber eyes fixed on something beyond the kitchen window that made her blood turn to ice water. It wasn't the usual posture of alertness. This was predatory stillness. Margaret's reading glasses clattered to the hardwood floor as she bolted upright from her recliner, her weathered hands clutching the armrests. The sudden silence felt like a held breath, thick with the kind of dread that crawls up your spine and whispers that everything you love is about to change. Emma's mind flashed to 8 months ago. The police at their door, the words, "Your parents didn't survive the crash," still echoing in nightmares. "Get to the back room now," Margaret whispered, her military nurse training kicking in despite her trembling voice. Who was out there in the darkness surrounding their isolated Montana home? And why did Shadow look like he was preparing for war? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Clearwater house sat like a lonely sentinel among the towering pines of northwestern Montana, 30 miles from the nearest neighbor and a world away from the life Emma had known before the accident. 8 months ago, she'd been a carefree teenager in Billings with college-bound dreams and parents who made her laugh at the dinner table. Now she lived in her late father's research station with her paternal grandmother Margaret, counting every dollar and wondering if she'd ever escape the suffocating grip of grief and mounting bills. Emma Clearwater carried her mother's Cherokee cheekbones and her father's Irish green eyes. But the spark that once lit them had dimmed considerably since the crash. At 16, she'd inherited more than most adults could handle. A mortgage on a house worth less than what was owed, medical school loans that followed her parents to the grave, and a wolf hybrid named Shadow, whose very existence violated 3 different county ordinances. Margaret O'Brien had buried her husband Tom 12 years ago, then watched cancer slowly steal her daughter-in-law Sarah 2 years before the accident claimed her son James. At 68, she'd planned on quiet golden years, perhaps traveling to visit the Ireland Tom always promised to show her. Instead, she found herself raising a traumatized granddaughter on a military widow's pension that barely covered the utilities, let alone the property taxes on James's research facility. The house itself told the story of better times. Solar panels on the roof that James had installed when grant money flowed freely, a laboratory converted into a makeshift bedroom for Emma, and everywhere the lingering presence of Dr. James Clearwater's groundbreaking work with human-animal bonding therapy for PTSD patients. His research notes filled filing cabinets that Margaret couldn't bear to touch, documenting years of work with military veterans who found healing through their relationships with specially trained animals. Shadow represented the pinnacle of that research. Rescued as a 6-week-old pup from a roadside accident that killed his wolf mother, he'd been raised by James as both companion and case study. The hybrid possessed an almost supernatural intelligence that had made him the star of James's presentations at veterinary conferences across the country. He understood over 200 words, responded to hand signals, and had formed a bond with Emma so deep that he refused to eat when she was away for more than a few hours. But Shadow's legal status remained precarious at best. Montana law required special permits for wolf hybrids over 50% wolf content, permits that cost more than Margaret's monthly income. The local sheriff had already received 3 complaints from hikers who'd spotted the massive black animal patrolling the property's perimeter, and animal control officers had made it clear that any incident involving Shadow would result in immediate seizure and likely euthanasia. Tonight, as autumn wind rattled the windows and carried the scent of early snow, none of those bureaucratic worries seemed to matter. Shadow's behavior had shifted into something Emma had never seen before, a primitive alertness that made her skin crawl with instinctive fear. The metallic snip of wire cutters echoed through the forest like a gunshot. In the darkness beyond the tree line, Marcus Patterson lowered the heavy-duty cutters, and watched the telephone line fall slack against the moss-covered ground. At 47, he moved with the calculated precision of someone who'd spent 23 years in Army Medical Corps, every action deliberate and economical. His weathered hands, once steady enough to perform field surgery under mortar fire, now trembled slightly as he reached for the electrical meter. "Power's next," he whispered into the darkness, though his two companions were positioned too far away to hear. The night vision goggles pushed up on his forehead were military surplus, like most of his equipment. Marcus had learned long ago that the government sold its cast-offs cheap to anyone willing to stand in line at auction, never questioning why a medically discharged veteran might need such tools. Danny Foster crouched behind a massive Douglas fir 50 yards closer to the house, his young face twisted with the kind of rage that had earned him his nickname. At 29, he carried himself like a man twice his age, shoulders permanently hunched from the weight of invisible burdens. The prescription bottles in his jacket pocket rattled softly as his hands shook. Adderall for the ADHD, Klonopin for the panic attacks, and Percocet for the phantom pain in his left leg where shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone in Kandahar 7 years ago. He'd been Marcus's shadow ever since that day in the VA parking lot when the older man had found him sitting in a stolen car with a pistol in his mouth and nothing left to lose. Marcus had talked him down, taken him home, given him purpose. Danny knew he owed Marcus everything, but lately, the debt felt more like chains than gratitude. Tyler Johnson sat behind the wheel of the idling Ford pickup truck, positioned on the old logging road that connected to Highway 2. At 20, he was the youngest of their crew and the only one who still had nightmares about his first job 6 months ago. His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind whenever he closed his eyes. "Tyler James Johnson, I didn't raise you to hurt innocent folks." But his grandmother was gone now, another casualty of medical bills and insurance companies that found reasons to deny every claim. Marcus had promised this would be their last job, enough money to disappear and start fresh somewhere warm. Tyler wanted to believe it, needed to believe it, because the alternative was admitting that he'd become the kind of person his grandmother had warned him about in her bedtime stories. The lights in the Clearwater house went out all at once, plunging the building into absolute darkness. Marcus felt a familiar satisfaction as he completed his work on the electrical box. 30 seconds later, his radio crackled to life. "Ghost, this is Rage. House is dark. No movement visible." Danny's voice carried the barely controlled excitement that always preceded violence. Marcus had seen that look in too many soldiers' eyes, the moment when training overrode humanity. "Copy that, Rage. Kid, you in position?" "Roger. Ghost." "Road's clear. Engine running." Tyler's voice sounded younger over the radio, uncertain in a way that made Marcus's jaw tighten. Uncertainty got people killed or captured, and Marcus had no intention of spending his remaining years in a federal prison. According to their inside information, Dr. James Clearwater had been sitting on research worth millions, breakthrough therapy protocols that pharmaceutical companies would kill for. The source claimed Clearwater had hidden documentation somewhere in the house before his death, insurance policies and research data that could revolutionize PTSD treatment. Marcus knew the value of such research intimately. He'd spent 3 years begging the VA for access to experimental treatments that might have saved his family. His wife Linda and 8-year-old daughter Katie had been waiting in the lobby of the Denver VA Medical Center when the bomb went off. A domestic terrorist with his own grievances against military medicine had walked into the building with 40 pounds of homemade explosives and a manifesto about government mind control. 27 people died that Tuesday morning, including the 2 people Marcus loved most in the world. The official investigation revealed that the terrorist had been a former patient, denied benefits after a suspicious PTSD diagnosis. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. His family had died because someone else's mental health treatment had failed, while the research that might have prevented both tragedies sat locked away in academic bureaucracy. Marcus approached the house with practiced stealth, Danny flanking him from the east side. The building looked smaller in person than it had in the surveillance photos, more like a family home than a research facility. Solar panels on the roof caught starlight, and a vegetable garden suggested someone had been trying to make a life here despite the isolation. The front door was solid oak with a deadbolt that would take time to bypass. Marcus gestured toward a side window that showed no signs of security reinforcement. Danny produced a glass cutter from his tool kit, working with the focused intensity of someone completing a familiar ritual. The window opened with minimal noise, revealing a dark kitchen that smelled of coffee and vanilla candles. Marcus slipped through first, his boots silent on the linoleum floor. His penlight beam swept across granite countertops and family photos stuck to the refrigerator with colorful magnets, images of a man and woman with a teenage girl who looked happy in the way that only came from being genuinely loved. Danny followed him through the window, landing with less grace but acceptable noise discipline. They stood in the darkness for 30 seconds, listening to the house breathe around them. Old wood settled and contracted, the refrigerator hummed softly, and somewhere upstairs a clock ticked with mechanical persistence. That's when Marcus heard it, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from the floor itself. Not quite a growl, more like the idle of a large motorcycle engine. The sound raised every primitive instinct he'd developed in 2 decades of combat zones, flooding his system with adrenaline and bringing his sidearm into his hand without conscious thought. Danny froze beside him, his own weapon drawn and trained on the shadows beyond the kitchen doorway. The sound continued, neither growing louder nor fading, just a constant reminder that they were not alone in the house. Marcus's penlight beam swept across the kitchen again, looking for the source of the noise, and found nothing but ordinary domestic tranquility. Then the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the growling, pregnant with the kind of tension that preceded explosions or ambushes. Marcus felt sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool October air flowing through the open window behind them. In 23 years of military service and 2 years of increasingly desperate civilian crimes, he'd never encountered anything that made his combat-trained instincts scream danger quite like this. Something was waiting for them in the darkness of the Clearwater house, something that understood predator and prey far better than any human had a right to. The creature that emerged from the shadows defied every expectation Marcus had formed during his weeks of surveillance. Shadow materialized from the darkness like a piece of the night itself given form and purpose, his massive frame moving with the fluid grace of something that had never known domestication. At 110 pounds of muscle and predatory intelligence, he stood nearly 3 feet at the shoulder, his coat so black it seemed to absorb the weak beam of Marcus's penlight. But it was the eyes that stopped both men cold. Amber orbs that glowed with reflected light and held an intelligence that was disturbingly, unmistakably aware. This wasn't the dumb loyalty of a household pet, or even the trained obedience of a military working dog. This was something far more ancient and infinitely more dangerous, a creature that understood the difference between friend and predator on levels that bypassed human reasoning entirely. Marcus felt his grip tighten on the Glock 19 in his right hand, muscle memory from 1,000 training drills screaming at him to acquire target and fire. 23 years of military conditioning had taught him to neutralize threats before they could neutralize him. But something in those golden eyes gave him pause. Not fear exactly, but a recognition that pulling that trigger would unleash consequences far beyond a simple home invasion gone wrong. Danny had no such reservations. His combat experience in Afghanistan had been limited to convoy security and checkpoint duty, Encounters with enemies who fought with improvised explosives and AK-47s rather than teeth and claws. The primal terror that Shadow represented triggered every PTSD response mechanism in his damaged psyche, flooding his system with the kind of chemical panic that made rational thought impossible. Jesus Christ, what is that thing? Danny's voice cracked like an adolescent's, his service pistol wavering between Shadow's massive head and the darkness beyond. The prescription bottles in his jacket pocket rattled as his entire body began to shake, months of carefully managed anxiety suddenly spiraling beyond pharmaceutical control. Shadow didn't growl or bare his teeth. He simply stood in the doorway between kitchen and living room, blocking their path deeper into the house with the casual confidence of something that had never doubted its ability to destroy any threat. His head tilted slightly, studying these intruders with the kind of patient assessment that predators employed when calculating the most efficient method of killing prey. "Stay calm," Marcus whispered, though his own voice betrayed the strain of maintaining composure. His military experience included encounters with guard dogs, bomb-sniffing German shepherds, and even a few wolves during survival training in Alaska. This animal combined the worst aspects of all three with something else, something that made his combat-honed instincts scream warnings he couldn't quite articulate. The standoff stretched into eternity, measured in heartbeats and shallow breaths. Marcus found himself cataloging escape routes, calculating angles of fire, estimating the creature's probable speed and attack patterns. But every tactical assessment led to the same conclusion. If this thing decided to attack, at least one of them wouldn't be walking out of this house. That's when Emma appeared. She materialized from the same shadows that had birthed the creature, a slight figure in flannel pajamas and bare feet who seemed impossibly young and vulnerable in the harsh beam of the flashlight. Her dark hair hung loose around shoulders that belonged on a child's frame, and her green eyes held the kind of steady calm that spoke of someone who'd learned to function under pressure far too young. But it was her relationship to the massive hybrid that stopped Marcus's world from spinning. The creature's entire demeanor shifted the moment she appeared. Predatory stillness replaced by something that looked almost like relief. Shadow moved to her side with fluid grace, positioning himself between Emma and the intruders while maintaining visual contact with both men. "He won't hurt you if you don't hurt me," Emma said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made grown men listen despite themselves. She kept one hand resting on Shadow's massive head, fingers tangled in fur that looked coarse enough to stop a knife blade. "But he's very protective, and you're in our house, uninvited." The simple statement contained layers of meaning that Marcus's tactical mind immediately began dissecting. This wasn't a pet owner making empty threats or a frightened child hoping to bluff her way out of danger. This was someone who understood exactly what kind of weapon stood beside her, and had complete confidence in her ability to control it. Danny's gun hand continued to shake as he struggled with competing impulses: shoot the creature before it could attack, grab the girl as a hostage, or simply run screaming back through the kitchen window. His damaged psyche couldn't process the surreal nature of the situation. A teenage girl in pajamas, commanding what looked like a small wolf in the middle of a home invasion. "Lady, you need to call that thing off." Danny's voice carried the edge of hysteria that preceded violence. "We ain't here to hurt nobody, but that monster moves wrong and I'm putting it down." Shadow's response was immediate and terrifying. His lips pulled back to reveal teeth that belonged on something twice his size, canines designed for tearing flesh from bone. The sound that emerged from his chest wasn't quite a growl, more like the rumble of an approaching avalanche, a promise of violence that needed no translation. But Emma's hand never moved from his head, and her voice remained steady. "Shadow, easy. They're scared, not aggressive. Can you tell the difference?" The exchange revealed something that made Marcus's blood run cold. This wasn't a girl with a trained dog. This was a partnership between two predators, one human and one animal, operating with the kind of seamless communication that suggested years of shared experience in dangerous situations. "What do you want?" Emma asked, directing the question to Marcus with the instinctive recognition that he was the decision-maker. Her eyes never left his face, reading micro-expressions and body language with the skill of someone who'd learned to survive by understanding the intentions of dangerous people. Marcus felt his carefully planned robbery sliding into uncharted territory. The research he'd come to steal was supposedly hidden somewhere in this house, documentation worth millions to the right pharmaceutical companies. But the intelligence briefing he'd received had mentioned nothing about a teenage girl or her four-legged guardian. "We're looking for something that belonged to your father," Marcus said, trying to regain control of a situation that had spiraled beyond recognition. "Research files, computer data, anything related to his work with PTSD treatment." Emma's expression didn't change, but Marcus caught a slight shift in her posture that suggested the words had hit home. She knew about her father's research, knew its value, and was making calculations about how much information to reveal. "My father's been dead 8 months, she said finally. "Whatever research he did died with him. There's nothing here worth stealing." But Marcus had spent too many years reading people under stress to miss the subtle tells that indicated deception. The slight tension around her eyes, the way her free hand clenched into a fist, the almost imperceptible shift in breathing pattern. She was lying with the skill of someone who'd had practice, but not enough practice to fool a former interrogator. "I think you're not being entirely honest with me," Marcus said, taking a half-step closer and immediately regretting it as Shadow's rumble deepened to something that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "And I think you understand that my friend here is getting nervous, which makes everyone's situation more dangerous." Danny's grip on his weapon had deteriorated to the point where Marcus genuinely worried about accidental discharge. The younger man's PTSD symptoms were cascading, triggered by the confined space, the darkness, and the presence of what his damaged psyche interpreted as an enemy combatant disguised as an animal. Emma seemed to recognize the deteriorating situation as well. Her hand moved slightly on Shadow's head, and the massive hybrid stepped forward just enough to make clear that the distance between him and the intruders could be covered in less than a heartbeat. "There's a small safe in my father's study upstairs," Emma said, her voice taking on the resigned tone of someone making a calculated surrender. "I don't know the combination, but maybe you can figure it out. Just don't hurt my grandmother. She doesn't know about any of this." Marcus felt a mixture of relief and growing dread. Relief that the girl was cooperating. Dread because he'd been in enough hostile situations to recognize when someone was buying time rather than surrendering. And in a house this isolated, with communication cut and backup 20 minutes away, time was the one commodity they couldn't afford to waste. The procession up the narrow staircase felt like a funeral march, each creak of the old wooden steps echoing through the house with ominous finality. Emma led the way, her bare feet silent on the worn carpet runner, while Shadow padded beside her with the fluid grace of something that had never learned to make unnecessary noise. Behind them, Marcus kept his weapon drawn but lowered, acutely aware that one wrong move could trigger a cascade of violence that would end badly for everyone involved. Danny brought up the rear, his breathing labored and his grip on his pistol increasingly unsteady. The narrow confines of the stairwell triggered memories of clearing buildings in Kandahar, memories that his damaged psyche couldn't properly separate from present reality. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool October air, and the prescription bottles in his jacket had gone silent as his trembling intensified beyond the point where pills could rattle. The upstairs hallway stretched before them like a gauntlet, lined with family photographs that seemed to watch their progression with silent accusation. Emma's parents smiled down from their frames, captured in moments of happiness that felt like accusations against the men who had invaded their home. Marcus found himself avoiding eye contact with a particular photo that showed Dr. James Clearwater in military dress uniform, the insignia marking him as a fellow veteran who had chosen healing over harming. "The study is at the end of the hall," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. She seemed to understand that loud sounds in this space would feel like desecration, though whether out of respect for her dead parents or fear of waking her grandmother remained unclear. Margaret O'Brien's bedroom door stood slightly ajar, revealing a slice of moonlit space where the elderly woman slept. Marcus caught a glimpse of silver hair spread across a pillow and felt an unwelcome stab of something that might have been conscience. This wasn't supposed to involve innocent bystanders, especially elderly women who reminded him painfully of his own mother's final years. The study door opened to reveal a room that looked more like a shrine than a workspace. Dr. Clearwater's presence lingered in every carefully preserved detail. Medical journals stacked with military precision, a coffee mug that still bore the faint ring of his final cup, reading glasses folded neatly beside a half-completed crossword puzzle. Emma's hand tightened on Shadow's neck as they entered, seeking comfort from the only family member she had left who could provide it. "The safe is behind the bookshelf," Emma said, pointing toward a wall lined with veterinary texts and research journals. Dad was always paranoid about keeping his important papers secure. Marcus approached the bookshelf with professional interest, running his hands along the edges until he found the concealed hinges that allowed the entire unit to swing away from the wall. Behind it sat a compact floor safe, military-grade steel with an electronic lock that would require either the correct combination or significant explosive expertise to open. "Any idea what he might have used for the combination?" Marcus asked, though he was already forming backup plans that involved Danny's demolition skills and a healthy disregard for property damage. Emma shook her head, but Marcus caught that same subtle tell that had marked her earlier deception. She knew something about the combination, or at least had theories about what her father might have chosen. The question was whether fear or loyalty would ultimately prove stronger than her sense of self-preservation. Danny had positioned himself near the window, using the elevated vantage point to maintain visual contact with Tyler's position on the logging road below. But Marcus could see the younger man's combat conditioning beginning to fragment under psychological pressure. The hypervigilance that had kept him alive overseas was becoming a liability in civilian situations that required subtlety rather than overwhelming firepower. "Try the date her parents died," Danny suggested, his voice carrying the hard edge of someone whose patience had been stretched beyond breaking. "People always use dates that mean something to them." Emma's sharp intake of breath confirmed that the suggestion had hit closer to home than she wanted to admit. Marcus felt another unwelcome stab of guilt as he watched the teenager's carefully maintained composure crack slightly around the edges. She'd buried her parents 8 months ago, and here were strangers demanding she use their death as a key to unlock their legacy. Shadow sensed his human's distress and moved closer, pressing his massive bulk against Emma's legs in a gesture of comfort that would have been touching under different circumstances. The hybrid's amber eyes never left the two intruders, tracking their movements with the patient intensity of something that understood the difference between temporary compliance and genuine surrender. Marcus punched in the date from his intelligence briefing, March 15th, the day James and Sarah Clearwater had died in a head-on collision with a drunk driver. The safe's electronic display flashed red and emitted a harsh beeping that seemed obscenely loud in the quiet house. "Wrong date," Marcus muttered, though he'd expected as much. Dr. Clearwater had been too careful a man to use something so obvious, even if the safe was hidden behind a secret panel. "Try Emma's birthday," Danny suggested. but that combination also failed to open the lock. Emma watched their efforts with the kind of detached interest that suggested she was calculating odds and planning contingencies. Marcus recognized the expression from his own military experience, the look of someone who was buying time while hoping for rescue or opportunity. The question was how long they could maintain this delicate balance before Danny's deteriorating mental state forced the situation beyond anyone's control. "You know what the combination is," Marcus said, turning to face Emma with the kind of direct stare that had extracted information from far more experienced subjects. "Your father taught it to you, or left it somewhere you'd find it. Stop wasting our time." Shadow's response was immediate and unmistakable. The hybrid rose to his full height, hackles raised and lips pulled back to reveal teeth that belonged in a museum of evolutionary warfare. The sound that emerged from his chest transcended simple animal communication, becoming something that spoke directly to the lizard brain's most primitive fear centers. Emma's hand moved to Shadow's head, but this time her touch seemed less about control and more about shared resolve. Whatever calculation she'd been making had apparently reached some kind of conclusion, and Marcus found himself genuinely uncertain about what she might decide. "The combination is my mother's birthday backwards," Emma said finally, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone who had weighed all options and found them wanting. "October 12th, 1978. Try 8791210. Marcus punched in the numbers and heard the satisfying click of tumblers falling into place. The safe door swung open to reveal neat stacks of documents, several computer hard drives, and what appeared to be a substantial amount of cash in various denominations. But as Marcus began examining the contents, he realized that Emma's cooperation had come too easily. The documents were real enough. Research notes in Dr. Clearwater's handwriting, correspondence with pharmaceutical companies, preliminary test results from therapy sessions with military veterans. But something about the teenager's demeanor suggested this wasn't the victory it appeared to be. Danny crowded closer, his eyes lighting up with the kind of manic excitement that preceded either triumph or disaster. "Holy shit, Marcus, look at all this stuff. We're gonna be rich." Marcus was already reading through the research notes, his medical training allowing him to understand the significance of what Dr. Clearwater had discovered. The man had been on the verge of revolutionizing PTSD treatment, developing protocols that combined traditional therapy with carefully structured human-animal bonding exercises. The pharmaceutical applications alone would be worth tens of millions, possibly more. But as he read deeper into the documentation, Marcus began to understand why Dr. Clearwater had been so secretive about his work. The research wasn't just academically valuable. It was deeply personal, growing out of the doctor's own struggles to help his daughter recover from the trauma of losing her mother to cancer. Emma had been Dr. Clearwater's first and most successful test subject, though she'd never known it. Her relationship with Shadow wasn't just the bond between a girl and her pet. It was a carefully constructed therapeutic partnership that had helped her process grief and trauma in ways that traditional counseling had failed to achieve. Marcus found himself staring at photographs documenting Emma's recovery. Time-lapse images that showed a hollow-eyed, traumatized child gradually transforming into someone who could function despite devastating loss. The parallels to his own family's struggle were impossible to ignore, and for a moment he wondered if Linda and Katie might still be alive if he'd had access to this research 2 years ago. "We need to go," Danny said, his voice cracking with stress and pharmaceutical imbalance. "Tyler's been alone too long and my meds are wearing off. I can feel the walls closing in." Marcus could see the truth of that statement in Danny's increasingly erratic behavior. The younger man was approaching the point where PTSD symptoms would overwhelm whatever rational thought processes remained, and that made him dangerous to everyone in the room. But as Marcus gathered the research documents, he caught sight of something that changed everything. A letter addressed to Emma, dated just 3 days before her parents' death. Doctor. Clearwater's handwriting was hurried, almost frantic, and the content made Marcus's blood run cold. Emma, the letter began, if you're reading this, then something has happened to your mother and me, and you found someone trying to steal our work. The research in this safe is incomplete, deliberately so. The real breakthrough isn't in any document, it's in your relationship with Shadow. You are the research, sweetheart. You and Shadow together represent everything I've spent my career trying to understand. Marcus looked up from the letter to find Emma watching him with eyes that held far more knowledge than any 16-year-old should possess. She'd known about the letter, known what he would find, and had calculated that reading it would change his understanding of what they were stealing. My father's research wasn't about training animals, Emma said, her voice carrying a strength that seemed to come from some deep well of resolve. It was about learning to heal by loving something that loves you back unconditionally. You can't steal that, and you can't sell it. You can only live it. Danny's deteriorating mental state chose that moment to reach critical mass. The combination of stress, delayed medication, and proximity to what his damaged psyche interpreted as threats triggered a full PTSD episode. His weapon came up with the kind of muscle memory that bypassed conscious thought, trained on the largest perceived threat in the room. Shadow. The next few seconds unfolded with the terrible clarity that accompanies life or death moments. Danny's finger tightened on the trigger just as Shadow launched himself across the room with speed that defied his massive size. Emma's scream cut through the air like a blade, and Marcus found himself making a choice that would define the rest of his life. His own weapon came up and fired twice, the shots echoing through the house like thunder. But he wasn't aiming at the hybrid that posed the greatest immediate threat. He was aiming at Danny, the man whose breakdown threatened to destroy the one thing in this house that might actually be worth saving. The gunshots shattered the night silence like breaking glass, two sharp cracks that seemed to hang in the air long after the muzzle flashes had faded. Danny Foster crumpled to the hardwood floor of Dr. Clearwater's study, his weapon clattering away into the shadows as his body convulsed with the shock of Marcus's bullets finding their mark. Blood spread beneath him in dark pools that reflected the moonlight streaming through the windows, and his breathing came in short, desperate gasps that spoke of punctured lungs and failing systems. Shadow had completed his leap even as the shots rang out, his massive frame colliding with empty air where Danny had been standing a split second before. The hybrid landed with predatory grace, immediately spinning to assess the new threat distribution in the room, his amber eyes fixed on Marcus with the kind of calculating intelligence that suggested he understood exactly who had fired the shots and why. Emma dropped to her knees beside Shadow, her hands running over his dark fur in search of wounds that weren't there. Oh God, I thought. Her voice broke as the full realization of what had almost happened crashed over her. If Marcus hadn't fired when he did, if Danny's finger had completed its pull on the trigger, Shadow would be dying on the floor instead of the man who had tried to kill him. Margaret O'Brien's voice cut through the chaos from the hallway, sharp with the kind of authority that 40 years of military nursing had burned into her bones. "Emma! What in the Lord's name is happening up there?" Footsteps on the stairs indicated the elderly woman was climbing toward the sounds of violence, drawn by grandmother instincts that overrode personal safety. Marcus found himself staring at his own smoking weapon, struggling to process the fact that he had just shot one of his own crew members to protect the victims of their robbery. 23 years of military training had conditioned him to make split-second decisions under fire, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the moral complexity of this moment. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, making a choice that would define him for whatever remained of his life. Danny's eyes found Marcus through the haze of shock and pain, and in them was a confusion that cut deeper than any accusation might have. "Why?" he whispered, blood frothing at the corners of his mouth. "Marcus, why?" The question hung in the air like an indictment, demanding an answer that Marcus couldn't fully articulate even to himself. He knelt beside the dying man who had followed him through 2 years of increasingly desperate crimes, the young veteran who had trusted him with the kind of absolute loyalty that came from shared trauma and mutual dependence. "Because she's just a kid, Danny," Marcus said, his voice barely audible. "And that animal, he was only protecting his family. We've become something I never intended us to become." Margaret appeared in the doorway, her silver hair wild from sleep, and her flannel nightgown making her look deceptively frail. But her eyes held the steady calm of someone who had seen death in all its forms and learned not to flinch from its presence. She took in the scene with clinical assessment. The dying man on her floor, the armed intruder kneeling beside him, her granddaughter huddled with the massive hybrid who had become the center of this violent storm. "Emma, get away from that man," Margaret commanded, her voice carrying the kind of absolute authority that made disobedience unthinkable. "And you," she continued, fixing Marcus with a stare that could have cut steel, "you put that gun down this instant before I do something we'll all regret." Marcus looked up to find Margaret holding Tom's old service revolver with the kind of steady grip that spoke of extensive familiarity with firearms. The weapon was pointed directly at his center mass, and her stance indicated she had no qualms about using it to protect what remained of her family. "Ma'am, I'm not going to hurt anyone else," Marcus said, slowly placing his pistol on the floor beside Danny's still form. "This whole thing has gone wrong in ways I never intended." "Wrong?" Margaret's voice rose with indignation that 40 years of widowhood and loss had refined into something approaching fury. "You broke into our home, terrorized my granddaughter, and brought violence into the place where her parents used to read her bedtime stories. Wrong doesn't begin to cover what you've done here." Danny's breathing was becoming increasingly labored, the distinctive rattle that medical professionals recognized as the sound of someone drowning in their own blood. Marcus had seen enough combat casualties to understand that the younger man had perhaps minutes left, maybe less. The bullets had found major organs, and without immediate surgical intervention, Danny Foster would die on the floor of a stranger's house, far from anyone who might mourn his passing. "He needs a hospital," Emma said, her voice cutting through the accusations and recriminations with the kind of practical clarity that crisis sometimes produced in unexpected people. "Whatever he did, whatever you all came here for, he's going to die if someone doesn't help him." Margaret's expression softened slightly as she looked at her granddaughter, recognizing the compassion that had always been Emma's defining characteristic. Even in the aftermath of having her life threatened, the girl's first instinct was to seek healing rather than revenge. "Phone lines are cut," Margaret said, her nursing training automatically cataloging the tactical situation. "And I assume you disabled our power as well, which means no lights for surgery even if I had the equipment." She looked down at Danny with professional assessment, noting the gray pallor of his skin and the increasing weakness of his pulse. "This boy's got maybe 10 minutes before he bleeds out internally." Marcus felt the weight of another life on his conscience, another death that could be traced directly to his decisions and actions. Danny had been broken long before tonight, damaged by war and abandonment, and a system that had failed to put him back together. But Marcus had been the one to weaponize that damage, to point it at innocent targets in service of his own need for revenge against a world that had taken everything he loved. Shadow padded closer to the dying man, his massive head tilting with what appeared to be curiosity rather than aggression. The hybrid sniffed carefully at Danny's wounds, then looked up at Emma with an expression that seemed almost questioning. Even in his final moments, Danny represented a puzzle that Shadow's heightened senses were trying to solve. "He smells like fear and sadness," Emma said, somehow interpreting Shadow's behavior with the kind of intuitive understanding that came from years of interspecies communication. "Not anger, not really, just broken." The observation cut through Marcus like a blade, forcing him to confront the truth about what he had done to Danny over the past 2 years. He had taken a suicidal young veteran and given him purpose, but that purpose had been built on Marcus's own need for revenge rather than any genuine desire to heal. He had used Danny's loyalty and desperation as tools for his own destruction, and now that tool was dying because of choices Marcus had made. Tyler's voice crackled through Marcus's radio, tinged with panic and growing hysteria. "Ghost! What the hell was that? I heard shots! Are you guys okay up there?" Marcus picked up the radio with trembling hands, suddenly aware that Tyler was still out there in the darkness, waiting for instructions from a leader who no longer knew what orders to give. The 20-year-old had been the most reluctant member of their crew, the one most likely to break under pressure and make decisions that would get them all killed or captured. "Kid, we've got a problem up here," Marcus said into the radio, his voice sounding older and more tired than he remembered. "Rage is down. Things have gone sideways in a big way." The silence that followed stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Tyler's voice came back, higher pitched and edged with the kind of panic that preceded total breakdown. "Down? What do you mean down? Marcus, what the fuck is happening in there?" Emma looked up from where she knelt beside Shadow, her green eyes holding a mixture of fear and something that might have been pity. "You can still stop this," she said, her voice barely audible above Danny's labored breathing. "Whatever you came here for, whatever you think my father's research might give you, it's not worth this. It's not worth any of this." Marcus found himself studying the girl's face in the moonlight, seeing echoes of the man whose work had obsessed him for the past 2 years. Dr. James Clearwater had been trying to heal people like Danny, like Marcus himself, veterans whose minds had been shattered by experiences that civilian society couldn't understand or address. The irony of destroying that legacy in pursuit of revenge was so bitter that Marcus could taste it on his tongue. Margaret still held her husband's revolver, trained on Marcus, but her stance had shifted slightly as she watched her granddaughter's attempt to find some thread of humanity in the chaos that had invaded their home. The elderly woman had seen enough of life and death to recognize genuine remorse when it presented itself, and something in Marcus's demeanor was registering on her experienced radar. "You're not just a criminal," Margaret said, her voice losing some of its hard edge. "You're military. I can tell from how you move, how you talk." "What branch?" "Army Medical Corps," Marcus answered automatically, the old identity assertion coming easier than any of the lies he'd constructed over the past 2 years. 23 years, mostly forward surgical units. Margaret's weapon lowered slightly as recognition dawned in her eyes. "Then you know what I know. You've seen boys like this one die because they couldn't find their way back from whatever hell they'd been through." She nodded toward Danny, whose breathing had become so shallow it was barely visible. "The question is whether you're going to let it happen again, or whether you're going to remember what you swore when you put on that uniform." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, forcing him to confront the oath he had taken decades ago to first do no harm, to preserve life regardless of circumstances. He had spent 2 years telling himself that the world had broken faith with him first, that his family's death had released him from any obligation to help or heal. But faced with Danny's approaching death and Emma's unwavering compassion, the justifications crumbled like paper in rain. Shadow suddenly lifted his massive head, ears pricked toward sounds that human hearing couldn't detect. His entire body tensed with the kind of alertness that spoke of approaching threats or opportunities. Whatever was coming toward the house through the darkness, the hybrid's enhanced senses had detected it long before any human would be aware of its presence. In the distance, growing steadily louder, came the sound of vehicle engines and radio chatter. Someone was coming up the logging road toward the Clearwater house, and Marcus realized with crystalline clarity that Tyler had made the decision Marcus should have made hours ago. The kid had called for help. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the October night like a death knell, their wailing harmony growing steadily louder as multiple emergency vehicles converged on the isolated Clearwater property. Marcus felt the last vestiges of his carefully constructed plan crumbling around him as red and blue lights began to flicker through the trees, painting the study walls with strobing colors that transformed the scene into something from a nightmare. Danny's breathing had become so shallow it was barely perceptible, his life ebbing away in measured increments that medical training taught Marcus to recognize with clinical precision. The younger man's eyes had lost focus, staring at something beyond the ceiling that only the dying could see. Blood had pooled beneath his body in quantities that spoke of massive internal damage, and Marcus knew with absolute certainty that Danny Foster would not live to see another sunrise. "Tyler called them," Margaret said, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and grim satisfaction. "That boy out there has more sense than the two of you combined." She maintained her grip on Tom's revolver, though her stance had shifted from aggressive to merely cautious. "Question now is whether you're going to make this worse by trying to shoot your way out, or whether you've got enough humanity left to surrender peacefully." Emma remained kneeling beside Shadow, her small hands buried in the hybrid's dark fur as she watched the lights approaching through the forest. Tears tracked down her cheeks, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. "He's scared," she said, and for a moment Marcus thought she was referring to Danny. Then he realized she was reading Shadow's emotional state, interpreting signals that only years of interspecies bonding could decode. "Shadow's never seen police lights before," Emma continued, her green eyes reflecting the strobing colors. "To him they look like threats, multiple predators surrounding our territory." She looked up at Marcus with an expression that held more wisdom than any 16-year-old should possess. "He's going to try to protect us from them unless I can convince him they're here to help." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. The massive hybrid who had terrorized him and Danny was now afraid of the very people who were coming to rescue his human family from armed intruders. The role reversals in this situation had become so complex that Marcus struggled to maintain any clear sense of who was victim and who was perpetrator. Tyler's voice crackled through the radio one final time, high-pitched with hysteria and guilt. "Marcus, I'm sorry. I had to call them. This isn't what we signed up for. This isn't what you promised it would be." The transmission ended with the sound of car doors slamming and authoritative voices shouting orders in the distance. Margaret moved to the window, careful to keep her weapon trained on Marcus while observing the tactical deployment unfolding in her front yard. "Looks like Sheriff Rodriguez brought half the county with him," she reported. "State police, paramedics, even some boys I don't recognize who look like they mean serious business." Sheriff Eduardo Rodriguez had been a fixture in this corner of Montana for over 15 years, a former Marine who understood the particular challenges of policing a rural area populated by veterans, isolationists, and people who had come to the wilderness to escape various forms of civilization. His voice, carried through a bullhorn from somewhere near the tree line, amplified words that cut through the night with practiced authority. "This is the Flathead County Sheriff's Department. The building is surrounded. Anyone inside needs to exit through the front door with hands visible and weapons surrendered." Marcus found himself laughing, a bitter sound that held no humor whatsoever. "Exit with weapons surrendered," he repeated. "Simple as that. 2 years of planning, 2 years of telling myself I was justified in what I was doing, and it all comes down to walking out with my hands up like any common criminal." Emma studied his face in the dim light, searching for something that might explain how a man who had once taken an oath to preserve life had ended up bringing death into her home. "What happened to you?" she asked, her voice holding genuine curiosity rather than accusation. "You weren't always like this. I can tell from how you talked about my father, how you knew about his research. You were trying to help people once." The question pierced through Marcus's defenses more effectively than any interrogation technique ever could. He found himself looking at Dr. Clearwater's research scattered across the floor, mixed with Danny's blood and the detritus of dreams that had curdled into nightmares. "I had a family once," Marcus said, his voice barely audible above the growing commotion outside. "Linda was a teacher, specialized in helping kids with learning disabilities. Katie was 8, smart as a whip, wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up." He paused, struggling with words that still felt like broken glass in his throat. "They were killed in a terrorist attack at the VA hospital where I was supposed to be working. Bomb went off in the lobby while they were waiting for me to finish a consultation." Margaret's expression softened slightly as recognition dawned. She had read about the Denver VA bombing in the newspapers, remembered the photos of body bags being carried from the wreckage. "That was 2 years ago," she said quietly. 27 people died. 27 people who might still be alive if the VA had better mental health programs, Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength from long-suppressed rage. "If doctors like your son-in-law had been willing to share their breakthroughs instead of hiding them behind academic protocols and pharmaceutical patents, my wife and daughter died because someone else's PTSD treatment failed and the research that might have prevented it was locked away in filing cabinets." Emma's eyes widened as the full scope of Marcus's motivations became clear. "You blame my father for what happened to your family." "I blamed everyone," Marcus admitted. "The system, the government, the doctors who had answers but wouldn't share them. Your father was just the one I could reach." He looked down at Danny's still form, watching the last irregular breaths that spoke of systems shutting down one by one. "And now I've killed the only person who still believed I was worth saving." Shadow suddenly rose to his feet, every muscle in his massive frame tensing as voices grew closer to the house. The hybrid's enhanced hearing had detected something that made his protective instincts surge beyond Emma's ability to easily control. A low growl began building in his chest, not the rumbling threat he had used against Marcus and Danny, but something deeper and more primitive. "They're coming inside," Emma said, interpreting Shadow's behavior with practiced ease. He can hear them planning entry, multiple people armed, moving with tactical coordination. She looked at Marcus with urgent concern. "If they come through that door and Shadow sees them as threats, people are going to get hurt. Good people this time." Margaret had reached the same conclusion, her military experience allowing her to read the tactical situation developing around their house. "Eduardo's not stupid, but his boys don't know about Shadow. They see a large canine in a hostage situation. They're going to assume he's either evidence or a threat to be neutralized." The approaching sound of boots on the front porch galvanized Marcus into action, though not the kind that involved weapons or escape attempts. He moved to Danny's side, kneeling in the spreading pool of blood to check for a pulse that was no longer there. The younger man's eyes stared at nothing, and the rattling breath that had marked his final minutes had gone silent. "He's gone," Marcus announced, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone who had watched too many people die. "Danny Foster, 29 years old, died because I thought revenge was more important than healing." He looked up at Emma and Margaret, two women whose lives he had torn apart in pursuit of something that could never bring his own family back. "You can tell Sheriff Rodriguez that he's dealing with one suspect now, not two." Emma's tears came harder as the full tragedy of the night settled over her like a physical weight. A young man was dead on her father's study floor, killed by someone who might have been helped by the very research he had come to steal. The cosmic irony felt too heavy for her 16-year-old shoulders to bear. Margaret moved closer to her granddaughter, weapons still ready, but her free hand reaching out to provide comfort. "None of this is your fault, child," she said firmly. "Not his death, not their choices, not the pain that brought them here. Some people get so lost in their hurt that they can't find their way back to the light." The front door splintered open downstairs with the distinctive sound of professional entry tools applied by people who knew their business. Sheriff Rodriguez's voice echoed through the house, commanding and controlled, but tinged with the kind of concern that came from knowing the people involved personally. "Margaret? Emma? This is Eduardo. I need to know everyone's status up there." Margaret's voice rang out with the authority of someone who had spent decades managing crisis situations. "Eduardo, we're all alive up here, but we need paramedics immediately. One man down, gunshot wounds, and another who's surrendering." She paused, then added with characteristic bluntness, "And bring someone who knows about large dogs. Shadow's with us, and he's protective." Sheriff Rodriguez's response came quickly, his relief evident even through the floorboards. "Copy that, Margaret. Paramedics are already staged outside. I'm coming up with 2 deputies, but we're going to take this slow and easy. Nobody needs to get hurt." Marcus stood slowly, raising his hands above his head in the universal gesture of surrender. The weight of Danny's death and his own moral collapse had settled on his shoulders like a physical burden, bending his spine with the accumulated gravity of choices that couldn't be undone. "Tell them I'm not armed," he called out, his voice carrying through the house. "My weapon's on the floor. I'm not going to resist." Emma's hand tightened on Shadow's neck as the hybrid's tension increased with each approaching footstep on the stairs. The massive animal could sense the tactical formation moving through his territory, multiple armed humans whose intentions remained unclear despite Emma's attempts at reassurance. His amber eyes tracked every sound, calculating distances and angles with the kind of predatory precision that had kept his wild ancestors alive for millennia. "Shadow, easy," Emma whispered, her voice taking on the specific tone that years of training had established as absolute command authority. "Pack. Safety. These are protectors, not threats." The words meant nothing to human ears, but to Shadow they carried layers of meaning established through countless hours of behavioral conditioning that Dr. Clearwater had built into their relationship. Sheriff Rodriguez appeared in the study doorway with the careful movements of someone who understood that sudden actions could trigger violence from multiple directions. His service weapon remained holstered, a conscious choice that demonstrated his reading of the situation. Behind him, 2 deputies maintained ready positions but followed their sheriff's lead in keeping weapons lowered. Eduardo Rodriguez was a compact man in his 50s whose Marine Corps bearing had never entirely adapted to civilian law enforcement. His dark eyes swept the room with professional assessment, cataloging the blood pool around Danny's body, Marcus's surrendering posture, and the massive hybrid whose presence dominated the space despite Emma's calming influence. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Rodriguez breathed, taking in Shadow's sighs and predatory stillness. "Margaret, when you said large dog, you might have been more specific." "He's not a dog," Emma said quietly, her honesty cutting through any pretense that might have complicated the situation. "He's a wolf hybrid, 75%, but he won't hurt anyone unless they hurt me first." One of the deputies, a young man named Patterson, whose inexperience showed in his wide-eyed reaction to Shadow, started to reach for his sidearm. The movement was barely perceptible, but Shadow caught it immediately, his head swiveling toward the new threat with the fluid motion of something built for violence. "Patterson, hands visible and still," Rodriguez commanded, without taking his eyes off the hybrid. "That animal's reading every micro-movement we make." Margaret, I need you to explain the situation while we get medical attention for the deceased. Margaret lowered Tom's revolver but kept it within easy reach, her nursing instincts warring with protective grandmother reflexes as she watched armed strangers fill her granddaughter's space. The one on the floor is Danny Foster, shot by his partner there, she nodded toward Marcus, when the boy tried to kill Shadow. The shooter's name is Marcus Patterson, former Army medic who lost his family in the Denver VA bombing 2 years ago. Rodriguez's expression shifted as recognition dawned. He had read about the Denver incident, remembered the photos of body bags, and the subsequent investigation into VA security failures. Understanding the connection didn't excuse the violence, but it provided context that changed his approach to the situation. Marcus Patterson, Rodriguez said, addressing the surrendering man directly. I need you to walk slowly toward Deputy Chen, hands visible at all times. You understand that you're under arrest for breaking and entering, armed robbery, and whatever charges the DA decides to file regarding your partner's death. Marcus nodded, moving with the careful precision of someone who wanted to avoid any misunderstandings that might result in additional violence. As he approached the deputy, he spoke directly to Emma, his voice carrying the weight of genuine remorse. Your father's research, Marcus said. It wasn't about training animals to help people. It was about teaching people to heal through loving something that loves them back without conditions or judgments. He paused as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. You and Shadow together. You're living proof that his theories worked. I came here to steal hope, and instead, I found the thing I'd been looking for all along. Emma's tears came harder as the full tragedy of the night crystallized around Marcus's words. A man who might have been helped by her father's work had instead become its destroyer, driven by grief to seek revenge against the very people who might have saved him. Tyler Johnson is outside in custody, Rodriguez informed Marcus as the deputy began reading him his rights. Kid couldn't stop talking once he decided to cooperate. Gave us a full confession about your activities over the past 6 months, including the 3 previous break-ins and the assault in Great Falls. The paramedics arrived as Marcus was being escorted from the room, their equipment clattering against the narrow doorframe as they maneuvered toward Danny's body. Emma watched them work with the detached fascination of someone whose night had already contained more trauma than most people experienced in a lifetime. Shadow remained pressed against Emma's side, his massive bulk providing the kind of solid comfort that no human could replicate. The hybrid had served his purpose, protecting his human family from threats both external and internal, but the cost had been measured in blood and broken lives scattered across Margaret's hardwood floors. As the paramedics pronounced Danny Foster dead at the scene, Emma realized that her father's research had claimed its first casualty, not through failure, but through the desperate actions of someone who had needed its healing power more than anyone realized. 6 months after that October night, Emma Clearwater stood in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows of what had once been her father's research facility and was now something entirely different. The Clearwater Foundation for Human-Animal Therapy occupied the same building where she had nearly lost everything, but the space had been transformed from a repository of academic theories into a living testament to healing in action. Shadow lay stretched across the polished wooden floor, his massive frame relaxed in a way that would have been impossible during those first terrifying weeks after the break-in. Surrounding him were 3 other therapy animals, a golden retriever named Hope, who specialized in working with children, an elderly border collie called Sage, who had proven remarkably effective with Alzheimer's patients, and a rescued pit bull mix named Courage, whose gentle nature belied his intimidating appearance. Margaret moved through the space with renewed energy, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun as she supervised the afternoon training session. The heart attack she'd suffered from stress that night had required surgery, but the cardiologist proclaimed her recovery nothing short of miraculous. Having purpose, she'd told Emma, is better medicine than anything they make in a laboratory. The foundation had grown from Emma's decision to honor her father's work by making it freely available to anyone who needed it. Rather than selling the research to pharmaceutical companies, she had chosen to establish a nonprofit organization that provided therapy animal services to veterans, trauma survivors, and anyone struggling with the invisible wounds that conventional medicine often failed to address. Tyler Johnson emerged from the small office that had been converted from her father's laboratory, a stack of intake forms in his hands and a smile on his face that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. The young man had traded his criminal associates for a job coordinating the Foundation's veteran outreach program, using his own experience with trauma to connect with clients who might otherwise resist help. "We've got 12 new applications this week," Tyler announced, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered that helping others heal was more satisfying than any crime had ever been. 3 from the VA in Billings, 2 referrals from the Tribal Health Center, and 7 walk-ins who heard about us through word of mouth. Emma looked up from where she was working with a Vietnam veteran named Frank, guiding his interaction with courage in a carefully structured exercise that her father's research had shown to be effective in reducing hypervigilance and anxiety responses. Frank's hands, which had shaken uncontrollably when he first arrived, now moved with steady confidence as he taught the rescued pit bull a simple command sequence. "That's wonderful," Emma said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet satisfaction that came from seeing theory transformed into practical healing. "Did any of them specifically request to work with Shadow?" The massive hybrid had become something of a legend in the regional mental health community, his story spreading through veteran networks and therapy circles as an example of how unconventional approaches could succeed where traditional methods failed. But Emma was careful about which clients she paired with Shadow, understanding that his size and intensity could be overwhelming for some trauma survivors. Margaret approached with a letter in her weathered hands, her expression carrying a mixture of pride and lingering sadness. "This came from the federal prison in Deer Lodge," she said. "It's from Marcus." Emma set aside her training materials and accepted the letter with hands that no longer trembled when confronted with reminders of that night. She had been corresponding with Marcus Patterson for 3 months, their exchanges beginning as part of her own healing process and evolving into something approaching friendship. The letter was written in Marcus's careful medical penmanship, each word chosen with the precision of someone who had learned to value the weight of language. He wrote about the veteran support group he had established within the prison, using his medical training and hard-won understanding of trauma to help fellow inmates address the underlying issues that had led to their incarceration. "He's up for parole review next month," Emma said, scanning the letter's contents. "The warden wrote a recommendation based on his work with the other prisoners. He might be released within a year." Tyler paused in his paperwork, his expression thoughtful. "Would you be okay with that, seeing him free after what happened?" Emma considered the question while watching Shadow work with Frank, seeing the careful patience the hybrid displayed when helping someone learn to trust again. Her father's research had taught her that healing wasn't about forgetting trauma or pretending it hadn't happened. It was about learning to carry the weight of experience without being crushed by it. "I think I would," Emma said finally. "He's not the same person who broke into our house. Prison gave him time to remember who he used to be before grief turned him into something else." Margaret nodded approvingly, recognizing the wisdom that loss and recovery had brought to her granddaughter. "Your daddy always said that people weren't broken beyond repair, just bent in ways that made it hard to see their original shape." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the therapy room as Emma returned to her work with Frank and Courage, surrounded by the quiet sounds of healing and progress. Shadow raised his massive head and fixed his amber eyes on her with the kind of devotion that transcended species, and she realized that her father's greatest discovery hadn't been about training animals at all. It had been about learning that love, freely given and unconditionally received, could transform anyone willing to accept its power. Margaret O'Brien understood something that took her 68 years to learn. The deepest wounds aren't always visible, and the most powerful healing doesn't always come from medicine bottles. After losing her husband Tom, then her daughter Sarah to cancer, and nearly losing Emma that terrible October night, she discovered that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or inheritance plans. It's counted in the bonds we forge with those who love us unconditionally, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4. Shadow taught Emma to trust again after trauma tried to steal her future, just as Emma's courage showed Margaret that being a grandmother meant more than just keeping someone safe. It meant helping them find their purpose. The Clearwater Foundation became Margaret's legacy, proof that when we pour our remaining years into healing others rather than nursing our own grievances, we discover that our hearts can expand rather than shrink with age. Sometimes the family we create through choice and commitment runs deeper than blood, and sometimes the love that saves us comes from the most unexpected places. Margaret learned that widowhood doesn't have to mean the end of meaning. It can be the beginning of a different kind of purpose. What unexpected source of healing or companionship has brought the most meaning to your later years? Have you found that helping others through difficult times has helped heal your own wounds? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.